Okay, so here we're looking at chapter 8 of my notes. That's why I'm showing you that front page. I realise that's not a very relevant note. That's the list of students who should be attending. But that's what you should have printed off when it came off. And here we go, aliens in a strange land. Living in an Islamic context in Egypt and in Indonesia. What I'm finding very interesting about Stanley's book is the issues and the questions that he asks would simply not have appeared on my radar if I'd been a curriculum for this session. It would have been very much based on my favorite theologians. You'd have got a lot of C.S. Lewis and Billy Graham, I suppose. I don't know, Jackie Pullinger. But here we're being challenged in quite different ways. So here we get to look at Egypt and Indonesia, and we explore a little bit of the question of what it means to live as a Christian community within the context of an Islamic state. It's rather difficult for me, I feel, as a lecturer who lives in a very small, rural, idyllic village, to sort of pretend to give a lecture like this. But it might be that it's just simply getting the conversation going, getting the questions asking. Maybe I'm very much looking forward to learning. This is why I wanted to do this seminar style with you guys all there, so that we could really chew some of this stuff over. What we see is a movement, or at least this is how we tend to tell the story. We move from crusade to cooperation, from diatribe to dialogue. But nonetheless, we still tend to interpret and understand our history, that in terms of how Christianity relates to other faiths, we tend to interpret it as intrinsically, in essence, adversarial, says Stanley, page 173. He points us to the irony of the ultimate origin of Pakistan's blasphemy laws, which he traces back to 1860, and the Indian Penal Code, which was intended to protect the sensibilities of all faiths, and that was where that started. So we're going to look at Egypt. We're going to be focusing upon the Coptic Orthodox Church. Until the 9th century, the Coptics were the majority. I find that rather surprising. I would have thought that would have been until earlier than that, for some reason. But there you are. Coptics, of course, regard themselves as the true Egyptians, not as aliens in a strange land. So, they view themselves as being part of the lifeblood of Egypt in itself. But as we've seen with Africa and other colonial places, colonials did not want to risk upsetting the delicate political equilibrium, so they were not at all keen on conversion to Islam. It had been monitored, but the idea of conversion from Islam was one that was not really contemplated as a possibility. Of course, when we talk about the British Empire, we do tend to think of it as a marvelous symbol of Christian, I don't know, conquest, unity across the planet. But as Stanley points out, at its peak in the late 1920s, the British Empire ruled over more than 100 million of the world's 233 million Muslims. British Empire, you could very confidently say, was more of a Muslim one than a Christian one. There's a dissonance between our Western post-Enlightenment philosophy of individual rights, freedom of religion, which is not the same as the concept of religious toleration that prevails in Muslim-majority states. We in the West, we tired of religious wars, and so we made it private and fine. Pick your own religion, sort it out, just keep away from the public domain, and so it got pushed out. Indonesia, when we get to there, we'll see a series of countries. We think of well, when somebody says Islam to you, well, I mean, obviously not, because you're a clever sort of person, but when it's said to me, my gut thought is, well, Middle East. You're obviously talking about the Middle East. 20% of Muslims live in the Middle East, 60% live in the Asia-Pacific region. And I remember coming across that and going, oh, yeah, I knew that, but I hadn't especially appreciated it in terms of filtering it through to my prejudices. So we come to Coptic Christianity in Egypt. This is a story of slow decline in numbers and in influence, partly through emigration to America, but also plenty through conversion to Islam. 2010 estimated that about 10 to 15,000 Copts were converting to Islam annually. The problem, of course, when a Muslim converts to the Coptic Church, they tend to be shunned in case they're an infiltrator, and so it becomes difficult to accept them. 1906, the Anglicans decided not to convert the Copts. Oh, that's nice of us. Early 20th century view is that I don't know. Is that we had that Islam would die off with the inevitable onset of modernity. I think we have seen that with the oh drat, it's just gone from my head, but there was that summer uprising. It's gone, never mind, it'll come back to me later when I'm not trying to think so hard. And we saw these different changes of leaders of the nations across the Muslim world, and a number of us were going, oh, you know, is this a good thing, is this a bad thing, what will this mean as the people's voice is spoken? Well, we've seen in Syria what that's meant. There is a moment, 1997 to 1928, a golden age of Christian-Muslim cooperation in Egypt. There's some rather nice stories that go with that. You have the WFD party in 1924. Would you look at that flag on page 62? Simply unbelievable when I came across that. That's why I put a picture of it in here. I just thought that was tremendous. But the problem with the Six-Day War, not the Six-Day Way, sorry, that's a typo, top of page 62, is that it strengthened the hand of the Islamists here. Nonetheless, you've got a bit of revival in terms of Sunday school and education, and in terms of the desert monks. Good to see the desert monks being revived again. Still, from 1970, you've got Christian-Muslim relations deteriorating markedly. And so they view that their only real solution is to emigrate if they are to retain themselves as an entity. And there's something quite saddening about that. Let's have a look at Indonesia for a moment. Here we have the largest Muslim population of any nation, and yet still we have a steady growth in the Christian community. Now, I believe that a lot of this is out of date. I mean, rather obviously, it's history lecture, for goodness sake. But I believe that there has been some trouble in the last 5 or 10 years in Indonesia, and maybe if you find yourself writing an essay that reflects that, then maybe you could incorporate some more up-to-date stuff than what I've done. Starts with the Dutch colonials, and we've seen this before with the British rule in Africa, a discouraging mission, unless of course it serves state interests, and subsidizing elements of Christian mission where it is taking medical educational work to the outer islands. But you know, there's a subsidy, and then there's a doing the government's work for them element there. But due to the 1929 financial crash, subsidies are cut, and so that forces the Christian church in Indonesia to pursue indigenous ministers, and so there you are. That's got to be a good thing, hasn't it? And so we see in Indonesia the same issue that we saw back in chapter 2 with Poland and Korea, that of nationalism. So that as Indonesia finds itself clear of fighting clear of Japan and the occupation, what kind of nation do we want to be? Do we want to be an Islamist one, or do we want to be a Marxist one? Not really sure why there's only two options, but it seems to be that there's only two options. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Christians sympathizing more with the Communist Party. Anyway, what they finally agreed on were these 5 principles that you've got laid out here. And the Muslims tried to add to number 1, principle number 1, there's one supreme God. Well, Christians and Muslims can pretty much agree with that. But the Muslims wanted to add, with the obligation for adherents of Islam to carry out the Islamic law. Now, you might go, all right, that's fine, because that's the law for you. I'm a Christian. I'm here on my island doing my Christian thing. You want to have an additional little twist to your thing over there. So you could say, fair enough. But you could also say, well, that's a bit disuniting, isn't it? That kind of implies that at the core of our identity of who we are as nation state is that there's a small footnote for you guys, which is different to my footnote for me. And so you could view that as divisive. And so the Christians were not keen on having that as an attachment. We see religion being weaponized, not for the first time, in the purging of communism. And so only 5 religions are recognized. Curiously, one of them not being the traditional religions that pre-existed all of these. And so there's a flood of converts, there's a flood of mission, which gets lots of people excited, including the Pentecostals. But it also results in issues and problems. So in 67, you have 14 churches being destroyed, and they sit down at the table, and the Christians refuse the Muslim proposal that each community should not make the other a target of proselytism. Now, look, at some level, that's a fair point. I wonder whether you listen to that and you go, yes, but we Christians, we're a proselytizing faith. That's what we do. We share the good news of Jesus. Jesus is grace. He makes a difference. Where do you want to go, heaven or hell? We have an answer to that question in Jesus. And I imagine there's a similar answer if you're sitting across the table and you're a Muslim. And you'd be going, yes, but Muhammad, peace be upon him, he's the one with the revelation from God as the final prophet. You've got to be listening to him. So in a sense, this strikes me as being quite conciliatory point. Me and my parish, I'm not supposed to go and do mission in the next door parish of my fellow Christian Anglican vicar, because that's how we as Anglicans work. You will have studied with Moira. You could have a lot of fun, with this half of the course and pulling in elements of Reformation history into it. The Treaty of Westphalia, 1648. Throw me a bone here because my grasp of Reformation is not as good as yours should be by now. But the Treaty of Westphalia, that was an end to the 30 Years' War. And as part of it, it was an agreement that, look, if you're a Roman Catholic, stay Roman Catholic, just leave it alone. If you're Protestant, stay Protestant, good for you, carry on. And we Roman Catholics will not come over to your Protestant state and show you the errors of your ways and the joys of being a proper Roman Catholic. And likewise, don't come and mission us with your Protestantism. So there you are. That's a version of this in a sense. But it doesn't take. And so we see the government begins to regulate the freedom of Christians to construct churches in Muslim areas. So that's a sense in which we find the government imposing the rule that the others didn't want to do. And so that's rather peculiar and interesting in its own way. I wanted to pull in something from Pete Gregg's Dirty Glory book about 24/7 prayer, because in the middle of it, I'm not sure if you've got this version. I can't remember whether this was the version. It certainly is not the version that I put up if you downloaded something in October when I put up a version of this back then. This is page 65, but there's a quote from Pete Gregg's Dirty Glory. It says, my notes say page 121 or page 100, depending on which version you're using. How many versions have I got? I had the enormous privilege, says Pete, of joining 80,000 others for a day of prayer and fasting. The vast crowd that night was connected by satellite with other similar gatherings around Indonesia, so that an estimated 3 million people joined in that prayer meeting. So there you are. That's Pete's book on prayer, and seeing how there's some good stuff going on in Indonesia. 8.4, the politics of Christian survival. So this is about living in a Christian, living as a Christian community in an Islamic country. And generally we see a move away from collaboration towards rivalry and antagonism. It's weaponizing of religion. Gosh, it's tedious. And we see in Indonesia because some of the outlying islands are capable of being majority Christian and are capable of saying, well, if that's the way you want to go, then I'm going to go like this, and separating themselves. And so by doing so, they're able to block a uniform Islamization of the state. Because they are so different. That's not a possible option for Egypt. In Egypt, the Christians there find themselves having to either go into a sort of spiritual introversion or to choose indefinite exile. My little phrase here about unreformed Coptics, I really don't see how reforming would make a difference. So I wonder if that's a little phrase of Stanley's that I just thought sounded poetic. But I don't know, would if Coptics were to reform, would that somehow help or hinder things in terms of how they deal with life? The challenge for Christianity in the Islamic world is to find ways of embodying the universal compulsion of the gospel that evoke the spirit of Christ rather than the memory of a powerful kingdom. It's probably a good point for all of us, including Anglicans, I suspect, here in this country. Thank you for watching. See you at the next episode.